Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tadaima Virtual Pilgrimage. My name is Rob Buscher, and I'm the Tadaima Film Festival curator, as well as the board chair at the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival. Today, I'm being joined by two of the co-directors of Fall 7 Times, Get Up 8, a short documentary about the Japanese war bride experience, Kathryn Tolbert and Kasmauski. Thank you very much for joining us here this afternoon.
Thanks.
So before we kind of get into the conversation, I did want to provide a little bit of context. Like many of the other films in the program for the film festival, this particular film doesn't directly relate to the Japanese American incarceration experience during World War II. But I think as we're kind of coming towards the end of our pilgrimage, and especially given the theme of identity during week 9, it's a great opportunity for us to delve into some of these issues related to the broader Japanese American experience. Obviously, many of our families who were here prior to World War II endured the incarceration experience. And this is sort of the dominant narrative, I think, through which we understand the Japanese American identity. But the further we get from World War II and the more people who immigrated from Japan in the post-war era, the more varied those narratives become. And I think that the identity piece has shifted quite a bit. So I think this is a great opportunity for us to delve into that conversation, particularly because both Karen and Kathryn are daughters of war brides who were featured within the film that we'll be discussing today. So just wanted to kind of provide that context as we get our conversation started. And I'm wondering if there's anything else to that extent that you'd like to talk about as we begin this conversation.
No, I think we're really grateful to be invited. It's an impressive amount of programming you have around the Japanese American experience, and I think that we've all, the three of us, have sort of we're part of that community, but we're not, and so this is an opportunity to talk more about that and how our experiences were different from the dominant narrative and why that was. So thank you.
Yeah. Karen, do you have anything that you'd like to add there?
No, I agree with Kathryn on that one. The thing was, as adults, I think is when we became more aware as being part Japanese. I don't think we were, at least the children of the war brides were never raised to think of themselves as Japanese Americans. They always thought of themselves as just Americans. That's it. We never thought of ourselves as biracial, even though we were. So it always came as a shock when someone pointed that out to us. Oh my God, yeah. And I think only as we got older and understood more what was going on that we could relate more to our Japanese side and wanted to relate more to our Japanese side.
Yeah.
Partly because that was our mother's intention.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When they came in the 50s, it was become American, and so they as from the film and from what we've written and reported on this, that they settled every place, and they lost their Japanese identity to a great extent. They expected to become American. So they took on American nicknames and, of course, their husbands' last names. So they became, Takako Funo became Kay Trimber. And, so they became, Barbara this and Margaret that, Margaret Olenek and, Nancy Roberts. So, the kids weren't raised to think of themselves. But what's interesting is that often the grandkids are getting Japanese middle names.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And well, it's interesting too because Japanese, I think in general, are very adaptable as a group of people. And so I think what these women did was as part of a survival technique, because they were the only ones in their communities, oftentimes who were different, that they just adapted. I mean, my mother made better Italian pizza than the Italian neighbors that she had, you know, I mean, when we lived in Bellwood, Illinois. So I think that's just what happens, is that you try to become the best American that you could, and you try to blend in and adapt. At least that generation did.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to hear you talk about it like that, because I think, honestly, for the folks who are listening, whose families were incarcerated, I think that's pretty relatable. I think a lot of the Nisei generation and the older Sansei who came out of the camps tried to adapt and assimilate as much as they could, in a large sense, out of a sense of self-preservation, but also trying to make sense of what had happened. So it's very interesting to see that parallel.
Yeah, I mean, they came to the United States, hoping to have a better life. I mean, these are the people who were children during the war, so they experienced, a wartime. They experienced the violence of war and the ugliness of war as children, and so I think when they came here, they just wanted to put all that behind them and go forward into what they thought would be hopefully a better life for themselves and their future families.
Yeah, I mean, it's compelling to think about. I think the farther that we do get away from the wartime experience, I think the harder it is for people to contextualize what that must have meant for anyone on all sides of this conflict. And I think, last week, we actually 2 days ago just marked the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Tomorrow is the 75th anniversary of Nagasaki. So, these kinds of memories, I think, there are fewer and fewer people who have those direct memories of the conflict. Obviously, firebombing campaigns that took place in Japan throughout the last months of the war had a dramatic impact. And I can only imagine, how that may have encouraged some of the Japanese women then also to seek partnerships with some of the Americans during the occupation.
And in this country, as they raise their children, they try to put that behind them. They didn't talk about that. And what I found is that some of their kids found out much, much later what their mothers went through. And when they found out about, that my mother survived the Battle of Okinawa or the firebombing of Tokyo, it explained to them a little bit about their mother and about kind of a lot of these women had some form of, I guess they're calling it PTSD, but trauma from that time that they put behind them, they thought. But then living in this country, apart from any other Japanese, they were isolated. They didn't have people to talk to, and so there was a fair amount of sort of mental health issues as a result of that. So, that piece of history that brought them to this country, did have an impact on them for the rest of their lives, really, despite all their efforts.
And part of it is they had no support group. So the people who were Japanese Americans had a whole community of Japanese Americans they could relate to and share their horrible experience with. With these war brides, they were by themselves. I mean, they were the only usually Japanese woman, or we were the only Japanese family in any one community, so they were isolated, and in a way that many of them didn't speak the language very well. Their whole strategy was to blend in as fast as they could. So even the kids never grew up speaking Japanese. We were all blended in pretty fast, and so I think for them, they didn't have anyone to share that experience with, because no one really could relate to that. Not even their own husbands in many ways couldn't relate to that, even though my own father fought in World War II and was in the Pacific arena, but he still, couldn't relate to some of the experiences that she had living on the mainland there. So, though he was completely sympathetic and a great guy. But it was just one of those things. They were alone.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about that division then as well. I know from the stories that my Bachan had told me, she served as the JACL Dayton, Ohio president during the late 70s and early 80s. And that was a time period when there were actually quite a number of both Japanese war brides as well as Shin-Nikkei families that were coming into the Midwest as Japanese auto companies were starting to do manufacturing here in this country. But one of the things that she told me was that unfortunately for a lot of the maybe the elders in the Japanese American community, they didn't have a great view of a lot of the Japanese war brides in particular. And
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
That's a curious thing, that image, and how it stuck for such a long time. And we found that when some women on the West Coast kind of organized groups, and they were married to Americans who they met and married in Japan during and after the occupation, and yet they did not want to be called war bride, and because it carried such a stigma. Yeah. So
on that, don't you think, Kathryn? The group was a bit. Some of the people felt like that was their experience, so they don't mind being called war brides, and other people, yeah, it was sort of divided on that topic of not being called war brides.
But you can also see in sort of earlier decades where the relationship between, in the West Coast anyway, where there were a significant number of war brides as well as the large Japanese American communities, that the relationship was not particularly warm because they didn't have kind of a basis to understand each other's experiences. So the Japanese Americans, having come through the incarceration, see these, young women coming with their soldier husbands, thinking that this is the country of wealth and they're going to have this great life. But then they themselves had some trauma from having been in Japan or Okinawa during the war. And so they felt like, they had a war experience as well. And so it took a while, I think, for those two communities to find some kind of common ground. But I do see now in like the Seattle area, there's quite an active group, they're passing away now, but in recent years, a group of war brides who are very active in volunteering in these, elderly care homes and where Japanese are, who want to hear language spoken, and so many people at the end of their lives want to hear Japanese or want to be spoken to in Japanese. And so there was, I think, a little bit more of a coming together and in recent years. But yeah, the basis for kind of mistrust and maybe disdain was certainly there in the early years.
Well, I would say that's true in certain pockets like Seattle, because there are a large Japanese community in Seattle and maybe in other areas. But I think in some other places, these women just didn't have that opportunity, because like where my mother lives, she's still alive and she lives outside of Norfolk, Virginia, a huge naval base. And there were a collection of war brides there, but they never did relate at all much to the Japanese community. And there wasn't this exchange. There just wasn't that many Japanese. I guess maybe that was part of it. And they just, now as they get older, unfortunately, they're all dying out, themselves. But I feel like maybe, every region of the United States, depending upon, the populations and how educated the populations were, they had different experiences, of course. This is a huge group of women who came over. It was we don't know the exact number, but the theory is 30 to 50,000, but we're not sure the exact number. But yeah, it's, I feel like it's like everywhere, people who have some resources can sit there and think about it and become a little more academic about it. But a lot of these women were survival. They're trying just to survive. They couldn't think about, am I getting along with the Japanese American? That's not part of their mindset. Their mindset is, how am I going to survive from day to day, and that kind of thing. A lot of these men that they married were enlisted. They were not people who are at the top of the food chain in terms of, their income. And so day-to-day survival was very important, economically for many of these women also. Yeah.
Honestly, I think it was probably more on the side of the Japanese Americans versus the war brides themselves. I know, at least in my Obachan's case, she was very intentional about giving the women who were married to GIs some leadership roles within her local JACL chapter to try and bring these communities together. And I think from her memories of that time period, there was probably a fear of maybe being a little too Japanese, left a residual trauma from being incarcerated that some of the elders may have felt. And even to an extent, a sort of scapegoating that may have occurred where people saw this person as Japanese. So, they're somehow related to what had happened to the Japanese American community during World War II.
So you say that the Japanese who were married to GIs were a little bit afraid of being too identified as Japanese?
No, rather the Japanese Americans were perhaps.
Oh, I see.
In that isolated example.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, our colleague, Lucy, she has told stories about her mother trying to, join Japanese groups and being rejected by them, when she was living in the DC area. She would think would be a little more educated and, a little more sophisticated, but.
There's also, I guess, the issue of class as well, right? Because I think a lot of people perceived the war brides as lower class Japanese. And even I think within the Shin-Nikkei community groups, it might be difficult then for Japanese war brides to integrate with Shin-Nikkei business organizations.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because the war brides really kind of they didn't come from a specific class. They were like the whole gamut, basically. So, yeah, but I do see there's differences in their experiences based on where in the U.S. they settled, and differences for their kids, certainly. And in interviews, I find, that kids all have experiences of, being bullied or whatever because their mom was Japanese. But, where I grew up in a small town upstate New York, there was very little of that. And so there is a kind of, a geographic difference, I think, in the outcomes.
Yeah, I think you're right. The geographical and also what you said, Rob, the economic differences are huge. Also, I think if you were a much more so-called higher economic class, you would probably have a little better time fitting in with other groups. My mother didn't even finish high school. She dropped out at, in 6th grade, which I think a lot of women at that time, during that time period of the war and, all that, it wasn't that unusual. And, and so they came over with not, speaking a very rough kind of Japanese and, being a little more, working class and blue collar than, they didn't even know that because they just came over here. Right. But, there is that sort of caste system that does exist with the immigrants when they come over. Right. And with other people who live here, the caste system that exists in the United States, economically and all that. So, what can you do?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the other things that I find really fascinating in general about kind of this time period in the immediate post-war is that for as much anti-Japanese propaganda as there was during the war years, there wasn't a whole lot that was done to repair those relations in the general public, except for perhaps the stories of the 442nd military veterans, and also I think a normalization of war brides. In particular, 2 films come to mind. I actually have lobby cards for them here. One is the Japanese war bride film that starred Shirley Yamaguchi, who during the war was actually one of Japan's leading propaganda actresses, and then happened to come here to the United States and had a brief but successful career. The other is, of course, Sayonara, starring Marlon Brando.
Right.
And, just thinking about the fact that Hollywood, absolutely under the guidance of the Office of War Information, would have been doing these kinds of stories with some intentionality. And it's just one of those things that I find so fascinating that I think we don't really talk about very much.
And there's not much in sort of that media world to give people other points of sort of recognition or comparison. And, this one kid in Boston, mother Japanese and father Italian American, at that time in the 1960s, there was a very brief period where there was a TV show called The Green Hornet, and there was a character named Kato, played by Bruce Lee, maybe. And so that was the only representation of an Asian that kids saw. And so this kid got called Chinese and Kato, and so there wasn't really an effort to, I don't think, repair or, it was just sort of, it seemed very haphazard. And so these women, in a way, were the ones in these scattered communities who were kind of the representatives of a different face of Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And the women, they were women. They weren't threatening. They weren't in large numbers. They were individual people who were trying to make their way. And so, they were kind of goodwill ambassadors. And I think the Japanese kids of Japanese war brides are, their moms were, invited to show and tell, and sometimes put on little performances. So in all these little communities, that was often the first real life exposure to a Japan that wasn't represented in World War II propaganda.
And what I find is kind of interesting I want to go back to this woman's issue here, because the propaganda films like Sayonara and all that, I mean, women are just portrayed, the Japanese women are just portrayed as being kind of like, pushovers. I mean, in some way. I mean, my big question was, how did that beautiful movie star fall in love with Marlon Brando as that kind of, not very smart military man? I mean, that didn't make any sense to me, right? But I think what Kathryn brings up is that it made the reason why these women were more easily acceptable coming into this sort of, highly racially divided country of ours was because they were women and they weren't thought of as being threatening. I mean, I can't even imagine what it would be like if it was Japanese men marrying American women moving into small communities in the 1950s. I think there would have been a completely different reaction. And so these are women, and they were protected by the big white American men, right? Or black men or whatever who they married. I mean, they married, they didn't just marry white men. And so I thought, this is sort of, it also plays on how Asian women were perceived at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's a lot to unpack there as far as, how these longer lasting impacts on stereotypes and representations, archetypes of characters who are Asian women within American media. I do think that you're absolutely right as far as the gendered dynamic here. It would have been a different story if it was Japanese men with white American women, particularly because so much of the propaganda actually had that as sort of the fear of racial miscegenation was used in some of the anti-Japanese propaganda, showing Japanese soldiers raping American women. And, I think that this is almost a way of framing the conflict in a gendered power hierarchy, saying that, here in a microcosm of a relationship, you have America as this sort of masculine, powerful provider, and Japan as the feminine who is being provided for and maybe rescued from post-war Japan. And that's just a total media studies lens on it, but I think that that's a lot of the subconscious reality within the media that we're talking about here. And which obviously I think in some cases may have been the perception in the communities that these families settled in, but obviously was not the case in all of them. And I would imagine far from it.
There's when you talk about the masculine America and feminine, there's a very good book called America's Geisha Ally by Shibusawa. That's exactly that theme. But I was going to say that when these women come to this country in the 50s, and so immediately they run into the problem of race. And what are they? Married to an American and giving birth to kids who are half white, half Japanese. So they don't, there was a tendency in some places to just regard them as white. If there was a choice in bathrooms, and they didn't know which ones they should choose, and their husband said, well, use the white one. And then when their kids were born, birth certificates, for a period of time, there were three categories: Caucasoid, Negroid, Mongoloid. And so the kids were listed as sometimes Mongoloid, or at least the mother was. There was a lot of confusion about how the kids were listed. Because I looked it up, I wrote to the registrar, was left blank. They didn't know what to put down, so they just left it blank. So that was, the 50s and into the 60s, where, race, the Japanese, because there was no immigration from Asia for that long period of time, when the Japanese war brides came, that period of the 50s, when like 30,000 or more came, that was the first big new wave of Japanese or Asians into this country. Because they increased, because the numbers as a whole weren't very high, but when the Japanese war brides came, they increased the general population of Asians in this country by something like 10%. I mean, because the numbers were small and there were 30,000 of them all at once. And so then they go all, they're dispersed throughout the country and settling in these communities and having kids who, in their own minds, they think are not, they think these are American kids. And this one woman who I talked to, when her son was born in a New York State hospital, and they gave her the paperwork that said he was Mongoloid, she put up a fight and said, no, that's an insult. He's not. But, so she made them change it to Caucasian. So there was all of that was going on, and so these women have become sort of a part of that. But they weren't talking to each other, so they were individually trying to make their way through this period. It's kind of what Karen said. They weren't a political group. They weren't like Japanese war brides,
Inc. Well, it's interesting, this whole race thing, because I know and it's kind of interesting when I think now, even with the we look more Asian than white people do. But like when you put down your race, I remember my father, being a military man, saying, well, just put down the race of the father. So he put down white. So I know I'm listed. And even when I applied to college, I didn't take advantage of the diversity thing. I just put down white, when I applied to college. As I said, what should I put down? He said, just put down white, because, I'm white and I'm your father. And so there wasn't, I don't know whether, that just sort of, you expand that out to all these different, we're all now so hyper aware of our backgrounds and everything. But like, Obama is considered a black president, but, half of him is white. And yet you never mention that. I mean, and so, but he, because of the way he looks, the way we look, we're kind of a confusing factor here, because people say, oh, you're white, but you look Asian, that kind of thing. So it's kind of a crazy thing to be biracial in some ways, because you look one way and then your little certificate or whatever registers something else, and you don't even think of yourself as, what does it mean to be biracial? You think of yourself as just, I'm just American person, and you don't even know what that means. And sometimes, so I know it was very confusing for me growing up. I know that, because I just did what my father told me to do. It was just like, just put down white, whatever. And he wasn't a racially conscious person at all. I mean, he wasn't somebody who was hyper aware of being white or my mother being Asian or anything. He was kind of like this just decent guy who just saw people as people.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to kind of delve into that in terms of the mixed race identity component, because of course that is what happened, right? We have the mixed race couples, interracial marriages between the Japanese and the American soldiers, and then they disperse and they go into all of these little towns around the country where people were recruited for the military, and of course they start having kids. And I think that that's probably one of the first times, probably the only time, when there was a concerted effort, in light of the sort of films that we were discussing previously, to normalize this idea of mixed race offspring too, right? Because I think even in the closing minutes of Sayonara, Marlon Brando is having this conversation and basically saying, his would-be bride is saying, I don't know, what would our children be? And he's saying, well, they'd be half me and half you. And there's something really amazing and powerful in that too. I think depending on obviously it's not always been a positive thing to be identified as mixed race, depending on where you grow up in the United States, particularly the time period as well. But I'm just kind of curious for more anecdotes. Karen, you were talking about how maybe you didn't think about it yourself, but how did people react to you and your family?
It's my father was military, so we lived in sort of a military bubble, but he was a recruiter, so we did go into civilian communities and lived in civilian communities. And I think I mentioned in one of the emails, our worst racial experience, was in the suburbs of Chicago when he was a recruiter there. And that's where I would get most of the bullying and most of the people asking very inappropriate questions to me. I mean, the one that I always loved is, "Are you adopted?" That seems to be the one that adults seem to always ask. And I don't know, to me, it was just horrifying because I never thought of myself as being different. We weren't raised that way. We were always thinking ourselves as just being like my fellow blonde-haired German, Italian girlfriends. I didn't think of myself as being any different from them. And yet to have these adults point that out was very horrifying to me. And then the other thing, of course, was the bullying factor, which I know you had mentioned yourself. And bullying was it was kind of a weird thing. I mean, usually the people who bullied me were these sort of young boys who were probably having issues themselves at their homes or whatever. And I would then be always protected by I had a gang of girlfriends who were all very blonde, and they'd like circle me like a wagon circles a poor, to protect the poor women and children, and I'd always be circled by my girlfriends. And it was kind of a weird thing for me because I never thought of myself as different. And these people would always point this out to me. I mean, the men or these bullying guys or bullying boys. And yet, my girlfriends never, would always stand up for me. I always felt very, grateful that they were always like, Karen's just one of us. What are you doing? I mean, they would just be like my defenders in some weird way. And that was kind of my experience. You never really, it was always a shock to me to have people point out how different I look. And even when I got to be an adult in the workplace, and I'd have people point that out to me in my workplace, and I would be like, "What? Wait, am I half Japanese?" It's just one of those things where you don't think of yourself as being that way. You're just going about your life until someone points it out to you. It's interesting.
By the same token, because of that, or what Karen said, and that's true for me as well. It was kind of eye-opening to do the film.
Mm-hmm, it was.
We'd known each other for a long time because we're all journalists. Our work, crisscrosses a little bit. We've all done assignments in Japan, and then the idea of doing something about our mothers. So, and it was an idea of, I don't know. Now it's probably 7-8 years ago.
Yeah.
And so there we are, we've known each other for decades and not really, and we knew each other's mother was Japanese, but we didn't discuss that. It didn't play any role in our, really in our lives. So when we decided to try to do the film, that was really the beginning of the exploration of our mother's experience. And amazingly, what it connected us to was the experience of many, many people across the country, which, because we funded it through Kickstarter and people sent messages. So we had like 400 backers, and everyone is a message like how they're connected to this story. So that was eye-opening, really, to realize that we were part of this larger group of people. We didn't
know there was that many of us out there. So, a part of it too was, I think, what we found that it was mostly our generation that was interested in this to tell the story. And usually it's usually the oldest daughter. What we've been finding out, it's kind of interesting. The oldest daughter is the one who's interested in finding out about who her mother is and what the backstory is. I mean, I know from my own experience, I had 3 siblings, and none of them were interested in this in the same way that I am. I think Kathryn, you had the same experience. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I think that there's always maybe one person who has an interest, and it's usually the oldest daughter, and the other ones just kind of go along for the ride, and I don't know what that means, in terms of your, sibling order or whatever. I don't know what that means, but that's what that was anecdotally, that's what we were finding out.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting idea in general too, because I think that I mean, this is by no means solely a Japanese trait, but there's such a intense respect for our elders and where we come from. I think that is sort of inherent within Japanese and Japanese American culture. So it makes you think a little bit about, whether that has some role in it, or perhaps it's because of the experiences that you all endured as the eldest, kind of paving the way. Which I can also relate to a little bit as the older of 2 children.
I also think there was something else coming in here, Rob. I think with us, most of us did not have a very smooth upbringing. I mean, not just with bullying, but also within our own families. Our mothers were pretty much old school Japanese. So a lot of them, raised us with the stick, not the carrot, kind of thing. And yet we were surrounded by our colleagues, our friends, whose mothers were completely warm and loving and hugging and very positive all the time. I mean, everybody got a trophy, that kind of thing, whereas with our mothers, it was like, oh, you're just not good enough, and sort of thing. And so I think for us, as we got to be adults and realized that, this was kind of, who is this person? I think there was a real curiosity. I mean, I think it really, I felt there was, I don't want to say emotional abuse, that's the wrong word to use, but it was hard, I think, for especially the women, the girls, the women who were, being raised by these other women. I think it was kind of hard in some ways to grow up under this biracial sort of, bicultural sort of situation where the mother is dealing with it in one way, and you're surrounded by friends whose others' mothers were dealing it in another way, and you're seeing this. I mean, in the film, there's references to that, where the mother comes in and is, kind of couldn't believe why her daughter would have friends because she was so stupid and ugly, that kind of thing. I mean, and verbally say that, to the friends. I mean, so I think a lot of those of us who were raised in those conditions kind of were trying to understand what that was all about. And I know part of the film was, I think all of us, the 3 of us, I think we were all exploring that too. It was like, what was it with this woman? Who was she? That kind of thing. We weren't part of that whole Japanese culture thing that you're referring to, respect for the elders or anything. I mean, yeah, there was some of it, of course, just in general, but we were part of a group of people who were surviving and trying to, blend into another culture group without any other backup.
Mm.
Yeah. So some of these women were even isolated from their own Japanese families. I mean, they were, being told not to come home again and, all these kind of things. So there was a lot of emotional stuff going on with this group of people.
Yeah. And I think, honestly, that seems to be the power of this film in particular, being able to capture that emotional weight on film. And I think to your credit, and Lucy's as well, the fact that you're basically coming at it from the perspective of daughters of war brides and have lived this experience, are able to kind of imbue your own perspective as directors. And I know, Kathryn, you had mentioned briefly about you all being journalists and spending some time in Japan, but kind of curious, I guess, if you'd like to elaborate on that a little bit. And, at what point did you see this story materialize to the point where you all decided, yes, let's work on this thing together?
In college, I started studying Japanese. And I was kind of pragmatic about it because I knew I wanted to be a journalist, and I thought that if I could, study Japanese, I'd have a shot at working in Japan as a foreign correspondent, and then I would have sort of a comparative advantage that way. So that was the beginning for me. I don't know, Karen, how would you put it?
We came at it a lot of different directions. I think my first contact was actually Lucy, who was the other colleague of ours, and she has a very interesting experience. I wish she was on this call because she actually did the reverse. She married a Japanese and went back to Japan. But she and I got to know her because I had pitched a story to National Geographic on Japanese women back in the oh gosh, when did I do that story? The early 90s, I guess. And we were talking and all that, and I did the Japanese woman story because, to be frank, I wanted to understand my mother. I didn't quite understand who she was. Whenever she would say the most inappropriate things, my father would say, "Oh, yeah, she's just Japanese," and I'm like, "Well, what does that mean?" So I ended up doing the story on Japanese women just to understand this group of women that my mother was part of, or was once part of. So anyway, Lucy and I have remained friends, and then I think Kathryn contacted me because my husband applied for a fellowship that she had done and had had that fellowship. I think it was a Stanford fellowship, Kathryn, and so she contacted me, and so we all three of us got to be loose friends and all that, and or good friends, I hope. And what happened was at one point, Lucy she was trying to do a thing with her mother, film-wise, on her mother. And I was in a kind of a lull in my career as a freelance. I'm a freelance photographer. And I said, I'll help you with it. And so we decided to do a film on her mother, I thought it was her mother, and then I said, well, you have to invite Kathryn in because Kathryn had wanted to do a book on her mother for a long time. And I remember talking to her about this almost 10 years prior to this meeting that we had. So we invited Kathryn in, and that's sort of the start of this threesome of trying to do this film. And it took us a while to do it. It's emotional, if you can imagine, to try to do this. And I don't think we were doing it the right way to have us do our own mothers. And so I invited I asked Blue Chalk if they would help us. That's a media company out of Brooklyn, New York, and they're fabulous. And they sort of brought in kind of that perspective that was needed, when you have such a strongly emotional topic as this for the three of us. And so they just brought in like that, that clean eye, I guess, in some ways, to bring in, and they were able to sort of do the story. The idea was not to have us involved at all. That was not the original concept. The original concept was just to do it on, I think it was Lucy's mom first, and then we were going to do your mom, Kathryn, I think. My mother wasn't even in the formula. So when Blue Chalk came in, they decided then that it needed to be the daughters, because they were listening to us talk about all this, right? So they felt like it had to be the daughters talking about the relationship of the daughters and the mother. And I think that was like a winning formula to me. I think they did an amazing job with this.
Well, and they brought in Megumi Nishikura,
right?
Who is, of her work. I agree. And it was going to be a short doc from the beginning, just because documentaries are expensive. But we did so well on Kickstarter that it grew from, like 10 minutes. It ended up at 26 minutes. Plus Blue Chalk kind of got invested in the idea of it. Once they started, they gave us a lot more time and editing rounds than we could really afford.
I want to give credit to Rob Finch on that one because he was the one who did it. Yeah. He's their content manager, or whatever, and he gave us that time. Yeah, which is amazing because we were only scheduled to have a 5-minute promo film to raise money on, and he liked what he saw and felt like the materials that we had gathered was so powerful that he said, if you're not in a hurry, I'll give it at the length that it needs, that I feel like the material has already been gathered, deserve. And he made it into that 26-minute film, which, I have to give him a lot of, kudos and credit, because I'm not sure it would have been done without that, without him, doing that for us.
So the project continues for us. We formed kind of a nonprofit called the War Bride Experience, and we're trying to create a longer film. It's a very slow process. There's the oral history archive that I keep adding stories to. And we were trying to get grant funding to develop a curriculum unit for junior high and high school students around this piece of immigration history. Unfortunately, we were sort of moving in the right direction, and then the pandemic hit, and the big funding organizations had to pull back. So
Yeah.
everything's on a pause now, I would say. Necessarily, we'd also been trying to get some traction on some kind of a traveling exhibition using photographs and oral histories. Karen's, I had after the success of the film, I was able to get a grant to travel around for a year and interview other families. So that forms a sort of a group of material that we can use. And Karen traveled a bit and did did portraits of many of these women. So it continues. We feel like we're not done really telling the story, and obviously we don't have a whole lot of time. Though many of the women, even the women that I've interviewed and done stories about for the Oral History Archive, have passed away. But their kids are very interested, obviously, in preserving those stories. And yeah.
Well, and these are such important stories, right? I mean, this is really, it's part of American history, but it's also part of Japanese American history. And I think that I'm not aware of any other projects that have done as much to surface those personal narratives as your film and then the following projects that you were just describing are doing. So it's exciting to see that, and certainly hope to see that continue.
Yeah, so do we.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, now that you have talked a little bit more about the additional interviews that you did, obviously you have plans to continue telling the stories, but I'm curious, out of that first cut of the short documentary, the 26-minute film, were there any scenes that you really liked that didn't make the final cut, just due to time?
I was trying to think of that, and we should have asked Lucy, because she was kind of keeping close tabs on the transcript of the film. The filming was done really fast. It was done over 7 days or something.
Yeah, for 3 different moms. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's not an obvious thing. I mean, we were kind of shell-shocked by the speed of which things happened, with Kickstarter running for 30 days in September, filming taking place in October, and Blue Chalk setting us up as mother-daughter on sofas. So it was it was kind of overwhelming from that perspective. I'm sure they didn't do a lot of scenes. I mean, they wanted kind of the atmospheres at home, and they spent a long time planting themselves out, in the street or in the backyards to watch the day start. So that's what they're really good at. We did not know how to make a film, so we didn't really have, I think, specific scenes in mind, that we thought should be in there. People who have done more films may have, but we were like, tell us what to do. They did let us. We had some suggestions after we saw the rough cut. And Karen, you had one immediate suggestion.
Yeah.
I mean, you thought it started too soft or something.
Yeah, I started too soft. I wanted it to start with Kathryn's mom, who said, I didn't love him. I didn't even know him, because I thought that was like, let's grab him right now. I mean, I felt like, as when I worked for Geographic, I did a lot of long form storytelling there, and storytelling, whether it's still photography or film photography, is fairly the same. You've got to grab people right away and bring them in. And I felt like the film just started out kind of slow and kind of leisurely. It's kind of like an NPR piece, right? Kind of leisurely, and all that. And I thought, wait a minute, we're competing against all these other films out there. We've got to get people in right away. And what is the question everybody asks? Were this a love relationship? What was the issue here? What motivated these women? All these kind of things. And I wanted to bring that in right away. And I thought, Kathryn, your mom was so painfully honest in some ways about her relationship with her husband. Mm-hmm. And I actually, if we were only going to do one person, actually, I was kind of, in the beginning, my thought was to do Kathryn's mother, actually, because I thought she was very articulate and talked a lot about the issues that she had faced and how she overcame a lot of that stuff. And to me, it was really, really interesting. but in the end, it became this 3-person thing and our 3-mom thing, and in a way it worked out pretty well because everyone kind of bounced off each other, and they all had different reasons for being and different narratives that they were talking about, and so that was I think successful in the end. But yeah, they did listen to our opinions, which was great. I mean, and did ask for suggestions, and we sort of rejiggered the script a little bit because like Kathryn said, I felt it started out way too slow, so I went out and did a lot of cutting and pasting and stuff. But I have to say they were one of the best companies we could have asked for in terms of working on this film. They were fantastic.
It's funny you should mention that scene because I think honestly that was one of the things that really stuck with me from the film, and that idea, that didn't even know this guy. It reminded me a lot of the Picture Bride experience that a lot of Issei women or Kibe women endured, and again, another one of these parallels that is very different, but in some ways also very alike, and I think is also worth considering when we try to reconcile these different narratives within the Japanese American community.
But it's also true that some women did know the men better than my mother did. My mother she just saw no future for herself in Japan. And she was smart and ambitious. But her father had died, or her mother was trying to, raise her and her brother. And they had been in Korea as part of the colonial occupiers and came back to Japan with very little. So she was desperate to leave Japan. But the other stories I've heard, there was and Lucy's mother is an example of that, more of a longer term relationship before, and that they knew each other better. I mean, obviously language was this big barrier to really knowing each other, but many couples describe love at first sight, but they're young. But Lucy's mother and her father shared, I think, an intellectual curiosity and a love of education that was the kind of I think a foundation of their relationship. Yeah.
I love the fact that it's the original I guess what do you want to call it, Tinder thing or whatever, but Lucy's mom found her future husband through an ad in the paper. So she was looking for people to practice English with, I think. Was that it, Kathryn? Something like that? Yeah. So, the scene is I think is in the film where she talks about how she met her husband.
Right.
So, of course there's 30 or more plus thousand women. So everybody has a different story, and some of the women did manage to get to know their husbands better when they, met them and married them, and others just jumped into it. So, it's everybody has a different story, right?
Absolutely. Well, we have a question from the audience. Thomas Kurihara asks, Kathryn, have you conducted interviews in the Twin Cities? There's a book draft of War Brides in Twin Cities written by Dean Potter, who passed before the book was published.
I have, and I know of the Potters. I had met Masako Potter when I was there, and I have not seen the draft of that book, and I would love to. Dean Potter, either he or somebody in his community shared with me some of his research about the role that Minneapolis played in the sort of Japanese American community as well, because of Snelling and the Japanese language trading there. But yeah, the Twin Cities is fascinating. There's quite a large group, and there's a Japanese woman named Yoko Breckenridge who runs a Japanese lending library in Minneapolis, and that's a group of people who, and it includes other generations, but they have their monthly luncheons and regular activities, annual garage sale. But interestingly, it's the children of the children who are trying to keep that going. But the children don't speak Japanese, but they're trying to keep the library going and run these activities, and yeah.
I had a chance to go and photograph that group, and I loved that group of women, and and the daughters, the older, our age daughters, who were there to kind of push us along. They're very cohesive and united, and they don't really differentiate even between the Japanese who are not there as war brides, but the war brides and the other Japanese part of the community. I thought they were a great group of people there.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about those kinds of communities, and of course, because of Snelling, that was a significant area for a lot of the Nisei veterans who had some role in the MIS and other language school training. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious if you can think of other cities or regions where there are substantial groups of war brides and their descendants.
Well, certainly around some of the military bases, right?
Around military bases.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Fort Riley, Kansas, and Norfolk, Karen, where your mother's got a community of people.
Yeah.
So, I'd say there aren't big communities, but if you talk about sort of groups and small communities, I would say it's around some of the military bases.
Mm. And most of these communities are dispersing, of course, because these women are older and they're dying, and their kids don't settle around the bases, right? They settle elsewhere. And so, they are getting smaller and smaller. My mom used to have a pretty big group of women who were war brides like her. And they're down to just a handful now.
Yeah, it makes sense. I guess I'm curious also if you have children yourselves, how do your kids kind of interpret the identity component?
You want to go for that, Karen?
Yeah, I have 2 kids, and it's really funny. I feel like they act more Japanese than their grandma does. They've kind of my mother, as like I mentioned earlier, was very adaptable to the community around her. So she kind of acts and dresses a lot like the people that she socializes with or who lives on her block or whatever, My kids, they just have a little more maybe interest in Japan, and both of them have been to Japan many times as children, because I worked in Japan, and as for National Geographic, I did stories there, and then I brought them. Well, with my husband, we would take them for extended trips to meet the relatives there, and my mother's side of the family. My mother had a little different experience. Her side of the family loved my father. Loved him. And so when we would go there wasn't any kind of problem with anything. It was like, how's Steve doing? They were all about, and they would ask about him. They wouldn't even ask about my mother. They'd ask about Steve, so it was kind of interesting. The experience that they welcomed us, and it was just such a great experience to go back and meet the relatives. And so my kids were a part of that welcoming, thing. They loved my son and my daughter, and my aunt would just, want to keep them and all that. So my kids had a very, interesting relationship, with Japan, and they love Japan, and they'd love to go back there again. I did not speak Japanese the way that Kathryn and Lucy do. I'd never had the chance to learn it, and working when I worked for Geographic, I went to a lot of different places. Even though I went to Japan, I was never in one place long enough to learn a language, so and I'm more visual, and language is not easy for me. And my kids, are the same. They ironically enough learned Mandarin Chinese in high school, in college. Interesting. And so they have just a generic interest in Asia in general. My son is actually in the U.S. Navy now, studying to be a medical doctor. And he joined the Navy because of my grandfather, and his grandfather, my father, and just wanted to honor that experience. And, so they don't, we're a mishmash, our family is.
Yeah, it's fascinating too. And I guess that's another piece that I was curious about, how you have both been perceived in Japan, because I also lived in Japan, and, I don't appear phenotypically Japanese, so it would always surprise people when I whipped out some Nihongo. And I'm just kind of curious, as people who've worked in Japan, and I think having mothers who are Japanese puts you even closer to that experience. So I'm curious what that's been like for you.
Yeah, because my babies are all blonde hair and blue eyes, so the Japanese, love them. They're like little toys or something. What was interesting to me being in the United States, though, having a blonde hair, blue eyed baby like that, is that I was always mistaken as their nanny because
Mm.
because I did not look like the type of woman who'd give birth to that kind of baby. So it was kind of interesting. My experiences were a little bit different in Japan than they were even here in the U.S. Traveling around with my children.
I find the Japanese that I know, it doesn't really make a difference that my mother's Japanese.
Yeah.
It's sort of more the fact that we can somehow communicate, we're interested in each other, that we have these ties, and my daughter continues that. She has been studying Japanese and is working on her PhD in oceanography and doing research in Okinawa, and so she has friends in Japan we lived there for 5 years when she was small, and I was working for the Washington Post, and my husband was with the U.S. Embassy, and so she had that 5 years to get started on the language, and so as a college student, she's trying to build on that, or as a graduate student, but her relationship with Japanese is one based on a long-term friendship and an exploration of each other's cultures. And so we've welcomed those friends into our home and done trips, and when she goes, they take her around, and so it's very comfortable. And I don't know that my mother being Japanese plays much of a role in it, frankly. I don't know. I mean, maybe there's a small comfort factor in that we know certain Japanese customs, and we, maybe are more familiar with certain things. I don't know. It's a good question, but that was kind of my gut on that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. And we are coming close to the end of our time. I just wanted to give you both an opportunity to talk a little bit more about how the Tadaima audience can sort of support your ongoing projects going forward. And I know you had mentioned that the COVID pandemic has obviously thrown a wrench into the production of the new project, but if there are other ways that people can be supportive.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I've been grateful to be invited to give talks or to show the film and participate in panels, which I did last fall for the U.S.-Japan Council. So, our website, warbrideexperience.org, is where we explain kind of the elements of the project, and then the warbrideproject.com is the oral history archives, but there's a link to that from the main nonprofit website. But I, welcome any opportunity to have further conversations and to participate. And I have tried to understand and be a part in a limited way of the Japanese American activities, and going to some JCL events, and because as an adult, I feel more connected to it in a strange way. So, and if Mr. Kurihara emails me and tells me how I can get a copy of Dean Potter's book, that would be his unpublished manuscript. That would be great. So yeah, that's kind of, how I would put it.
Yeah. I mean, I just put in the 2 cents worth that we need funding. I mean, that's big. And for us, Kathryn mentioned a traveling exhibit that I guess we could just say the Smithsonian has it under consideration right now. I mean, no positive, negative thing, just, they're considering it seriously, their sites for their site project. And they, we're needing funding. We need to look for funding. So if they're, big corporate sponsors or whatever that they can help to get this message out there, that would be fantastic. And part of the whole educational programming would be attached to that exhibit if we had it, if it does happen. So, but COVID has really put a huge wrench into that. We were kind of all on a pathway here, and then all of a sudden it just stopped in the water. So, like everything else. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess that would be, for me, that would that would be the big thing that we are looking for, is trying to find some funding so that that exhibit can go forward.
All right. Well, we'll certainly look forward to hearing more about that as it develops. And I assume if people go to the website that they'll be able to find out more about that.
Yeah, we'll try to keep it updated. We haven't updated it in quite a long time, but yeah, but the links are all there. So
great. Well, thank you both again for joining us this afternoon. I've enjoyed our conversation, and I hope our audience was able to learn a little bit more about some of the many different experiences that we have as Japanese Americans.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks so much for inviting us.
Thanks again.